Yeah, so most people have strong views on Canada's First Nations policies, issues, challenges. One of the challenges is that most people have never actually been on a First Nations reserve. They don't understand some of the reasons that are leading to the housing problems, the social problems, the economic problems, the water problems, the drug use problems. The problems really stack up. And the root of the problem is the reserve system. But I'll lay out more of that and explain it. So that's why I'm out in this blustery, cold day on the highway. We're going to go into the Siksika Reserve in Alberta, and I'll give you a tour of some of the aspects of the reserve, spots on the reserve, to kind of give people a better idea of why some of those challenges are there, and why the solutions just seem not to be coming.
All right, so the Siksika Reserve is the second largest reserve in Canada. It's about an hour east of Calgary. It used to be called the Blackfoot Reserve until recently, relatively, anyways. Uh, just like the Blood Reserve is now the Kainai, Pagan is now Pekingese, Sarcee is now Tsuut'ina. They're all part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which runs through the southern plains and all the way into Montana. And the reserve falls under Treaty 7. The population of the reserve is roughly 3,600 people, and it covers 269 square miles. The land's prairie, it's mostly arid, and it actually isn't very good for crop production. The Bow River bisects the reserve, and it does offer resource for some irrigation farming. And the land likely looked fantastic back at treaty time for people who relied on buffalo hunting and plains living in the 1800s. Today, though, it provides a pretty bleak landscape with few resources for modern living. So, again, I'm going to be pretty critical of my narrative, but please don't mistake my being critical for that of being critical of the people or the race. It's the system which is sick. And it doesn't matter which race, any race would suffer from socioeconomic dysfunction if it was isolated on a race based enclave, as those living on reserves are. I mean, look at the housing here, guys. It's just falling apart. And, I'll explain that. Like, we see the houses. Some people get critical if they've gone through reserves. You can see these relatively recent ones have been boarded up. They're somewhat new, but they were unfortunately abused and lived in so poorly maintained, they got condemned. And what people have to realize is these people don't own the houses. You don't have private property ownership on reserves. The houses are all owned by the band. They're built and assigned to people. So there's no benefit in maintaining the house. You can't build equity in it. You can't sell it later. It's not a nest egg for later retirement. Uh, it just turns into problems. Another issue, just to be seen throughout, is feral dogs. You see them all over the place on reserves. They run loose. They're unfixed. Sometimes they're connected to homes. Other times they aren't. But it's just another visible thing you'll see on reserves, demonstrating some of the dysfunction and the problems. So back to the housing again. If you don't own it, why are you going to maintain it? Now, water is another issue. People talk about clean water on reserves all the time. As you can see from that well, it's frozen up. You see, people think in terms of like city water, city ability, but you see, with spread out houses, you can't have centralized water supplies, and that's a septic system. So when you live rurally, you have to maintain your own water. You have to watch the filtration. You have to watch the septic systems, or you can get contamination and get some serious problems with it. That's why there's water problems going on in the reserves. Now, the Blackfoot Reserve has two towns bordering on it. They're right next to it, and they're split by a rail line. One of them is the town of Gleason. And Gleason has a long, storied history as a trading center and other things. But now, due to its isolation and proximity to the reserve, it's fallen on rough times. On the reserve side here, you can see there's a very dilapidated gas station. The band administration offices are there. There's a recreation facility, a senior center, but for the most part, unfortunately, the town is pretty run down and rough. This is on the non-native side of the tracks. It's literally tracks that bisect it, but it's mostly the Siksika population that I guess patronizes the town. Business-wise, though, there really isn't much for people to go to within the town. So they've just let things fall down. The courthouse is still up and operational. There's old facilities that were built on the south side of town as well that have fallen into disrepair and have been let go. Because again, if you don't own things, how do you get rolling? How do you get businesses going? How do you build equity if you don't even have the house? There's a lot of people with ambition, but what do you do out on this isolated reserve to keep things rolling? Sadly, the downtown, the businesses that are working, there's two liquor stores in this tiny little downtown. There are bricked up buildings again where the business is shut down over the years. The crime rate on reserves is terrible, unfortunately. Uh, I mean, that's part of pretty much every socio-economic measure. There's a cannabis store as well. Yes, that's another thing that's still managing to sell there. There's been efforts to try to change things, but they just aren't taking off. I mean, the average income on the reserve right now is about $24,000. That's pretty much half of what the average Canadian makes. About 34% of the population is actually employed, and of them, most of them specialized in public administration, real estate, and educational services. In other words, they work for the reserve. It's just inside things. There's no industry or things going on out there to keep things rolling. Unfortunately, there used to be they had their own police force. That unfortunately fell by the wayside due to rampant corruption. It fell apart. The band actually petitioned, begging for the RCMP to come in and replace the local police force because the local police force had turned into bandits. Now, you can see, of all things in Galicia, though, a town of 300, they got about a dozen police trucks there. It kind of gives an indication of some of the high crime problem down there, unfortunately. Uh, they're bringing back tribal police, which is good. I mean, if they communicate with the community, but part of the problem is lack of oversight, and that happens financially as well. You've got here's a medical center, by the way. Yeah, no windows. It's almost like a little fortress. That's the closest they come. And again, you got a lot of health issues. In fact, this is the most striking illustration of the failure right now is the average life expectancy of a First Nations person in Canada is about 20 years lower than the life expectancy for people not on the First Nation. That's outrageous. This is the town of Clooney, the other one that's right next to it. Here's a cannabis shop, one of the two operating businesses, and the other one's a liquor store. You don't have, I think there's a little grocery store in Gleason. They have to travel to get out of there. Sadly, the most lucrative businesses are selling substances. Here's the post office, just a trailer that's barred up because the other ones tend to get vandalized and torn down. But I mean, how are we still putting up with this? Look at the conditions, and I mean this is again in Clooney, which isn't in the reserve; it's just right next to it. But because of that proximity, the town itself becomes unsustainable. Now, the reserve has some resources. There's oil and gas, quite a bit on the reserve. That comes in it comes in with royalties to the band. The band gets millions of dollars, and theoretically and hopefully disperses that to services for the members. It doesn't provide a heck of a lot of jobs for people, unfortunately. The oil field contractors tend to come from outside. The wells are in place, the revenues come in. It's good for people and everything, but it doesn't provide long term employment for a lot of people. Now, likewise, there's a lot of agricultural land. The initial intent for these reserves was actually, and it was misplaced. Sir John A. Macdonald had that intention, was to turn it into an agricultural society. They sent people out to train them how to farm. They gave them implements and equipment. That's not from Sir John A. Macdonald's days, that broken down tractor there, but it sort of shows some of the things that were attempted. It just didn't work out. They were nomadic people, hunters, gatherers. Now, if you look at this little irrigation block, this is the red line is the border of the reserve. You can see all that green farming going on within the reserve. Well, it's kind of interesting. What it is if you've got irrigation, you can grow really good crops out there. If you've got, you're able to water that ground. It takes a lot of management, though, technical expertise, and investment to do so. So what you see on these reserves on the prairies, when you do see developed farmland, which is great, is actually most of the time it's Hutterite colonies. There's going to be a Hutterite colony bounding a reserve almost every time down in these southern ones. This is the colony, a great big operation. So what they do, the Hutterites set up. They're very efficient farmers. They're an interesting culture in them, of themselves. I should do a video on them sometime. But they set up and they rent the land from the band and they farm it. So they maintain the irrigation systems and do the harvest and the rest of it. It's a symbiotic relationship. They get along quite well and they always have. And there's nothing wrong with it. But again, it doesn't provide general revenue. See, what you kind of see on a reserve is collectivist living. If a First Nations person wanted to pick a part of the land on the reserve and farm, well, where would you start? You'd have to rent the land from your own reserve, get the equipment, farm the land, harvest, maintain it. It just doesn't work out. That business model just doesn't quite cut it in the case of a reserve. So you end up with Hutterites taking on the task around the Blood Reserve. That's down in southern Alberta. That's the biggest reserve in Canada, and it's got 6 Hutterite colonies, with about 150 people in each colony, all the way around. You follow a map. Some pictures I'll have coming up on here in a little bit to show that it's actually ringed by Hutterite colonies. Again, hey, why not use the land, get somebody who's into it? But what do you do with these 3,000 people plus that need jobs, need a purpose, need employment? Like, this is the question on reserves. It's nearly dead end, and that's what I got to keep asking people. They keep saying we got to fund it better. Well, fine, but what's the long game? What do you see for somebody living in some of that housing in one of those isolated areas in this modern world? Where is it going to change? At what point is there going to be a break in this? And there's none to be seen. The reality is this reserve system somehow has to end. You can't flick it off like a light switch, but we've got to somehow instill property rights. We've got to bring about a way for people to establish themselves, break away from the cycle of dependency. It's so dehumanizing. It's so terrible. Let them become independent, feel pride. Now, one of the things that caused damage, without doubt, was the residential school system. And there was one on this reserve. There was a school, and I'll show some footage of it and chat a little bit more about this, the old Sun College it is now.
So this was the residential school. It's now Old Sun Community College. Classic brick building out on the reserve. At least I guess they're repurposing it or maintaining it and keeping it for a good use today. Education is good. But the residential school concept was terribly misplaced to say the least. The social damage it caused is still being felt today. We've got I guess a lot of interpretations, exaggerations of some of the stuff that happened, but there's no doubt there was abuses. The intent was to train them. They called them industrial schools initially, and thought that perhaps First Nations people would get into the trades. You can see by the cross up top, they handed it off to churches to do so. You got to remember 100 years ago, churches weren't looking at a progressive way to educate. The old spare the rod, spoil the child concept. And it was rough. I mean, taking kids from households on the prairie or whatnot, bringing them in here, having them live in this environment where unfortunately it did draw and attract predators as they are drawn to institutions where kids are around in general. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. But we got to start looking beyond that. That's part of the issue. I mean, how much longer can we apologize? How much longer can we blame every issue on what was done in these places? We've got to look further. So the remnants are there. It's a good reminder. I mean, there's been a lot of churches burned by activists and such. Better to maintain these and I think, have a testament just to the history and what was.
Now, this is a cemetery on the Blackfoot Reserve. There's a number of them there. It was well, the alleged graves found at the Kamloops residential school site that really brought residential schools into the news. And now all sorts of reserves have been going out and claiming they're finding a whole bunch of unidentified mass graves and such. This is behind the residential school. But as you can see, First Nations people look at cemeteries differently than European people do. They don't tend to use permanent markers. You see a few gravestones, it's usually wooden, and of course they will wear away. And they don't immaculately maintain the reserve, I should say, the cemetery, as we do in other ones. So it looks run down. And it's not a matter of neglect, just a different outlook. They let nature take it. But let's not let some of the, and let's face it, there's race hustlers, there's grifters, there's people trying to make money out of the issue. So they go in areas like this and pretend that these were hidden graveyards or unidentified graves and such. This is just the nature of the cemeteries from those days. I mean, aside from those little mounds, you can barely tell it was there was people buried there at those times. Now this is Crowfoot, Chief Crowfoot, and this was the name of the sake of the cemetery. He was probably Canada's most influential chief at the end of the 1800s. He was a peacemaker. When the Riel Rebellion happened, he refused to participate. He signed Treaty 7. He pulled a lot of the bands together. So just to get on some positive stuff, his grave site was here, and he was quite a man. He tried to work towards integration. Not everything worked out as well as they would hope, of course. So I mean, if you're going to go down a tour of the reserve, check out the cemetery, check out Crowfoot's grave site. The monument is on the hill. It's publicly accessible. It's where Treaty 7 was signed. Unfortunately, again, you find litter of old pot containers, and somebody stole the plaque from the thing. But what we got is a very interesting. It's a beautiful area. It's kind of bleak this time of year. When it goes green, it's really something else to see. It's scenic, and yeah, you could see as well the final camping place of Chief Crowfoot. He was very venerated. There's a fence around it. You can see the ring of a teepee ring and a center fire pit. There's an interpretive center called Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. Look, I'm just saying people need to get out and see for themselves and then think of things. I don't have every solution. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm sure certainly wrong on lots of things. But a lot of the people making political policy or lobbying for different things on reserves and such are coming from an urban environment. They've never actually been there. And I really think a lot of people should take the opportunity to have a look. I mean, look at the positive things, look at the history, look at these interpretive centers, but don't forget to get out and look at the housing too. Look at the wild dogs. Look at the trash. Look at the sadness, the waste of good people, and try to just do a mental exercise, as I said, and look at the long game. What do you see in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years if nothing changes on these reserves? And it doesn't look good. It's not a good, healthy, long-term outlook. So I just wanted to make this video so people can kind of have a look. Not everybody gets the chance to drive out there. And I spent myself 20 years in the oil field. I spent a lot of time on those reserves, and it's always been an issue that's frustrated me. It's one of Canada's shames, but we're trying to double down. We're trying to fix the problem by entrenching even more dependency rather than integration. And it doesn't mean assimilation. We got lots of populations from all sorts of ethnicities that maintain cultural practices but still are integrated with the rest of the modern world. So thanks. Put comments in, send ideas my way. I'm more than happy because this is to listen to other views because this is something that's got to be taken care of. But I just wanted to share that perspective. If you can't drive out there, well, here's a bit of what it looks like, folks. Thanks.